We've all known that crushing feeling of being the only one left out while everyone else celebrates around us. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything, especially when they come from the most unexpected person. In the great hall of Vargstad, shy Thyra sat alone as warriors mocked her simple blue dress. The other girls danced while she remained untouched by any suitor. But when the laughter grew cruel, something extraordinary happened. Jorund Bearblood, the most feared warrior in the north, stood up and walked toward her. The entire hall fell silent. What could this giant want with the girl everyone ignored? What happened next would silence their mockery forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The torches flickered against the stone walls of Vargstad's great hall, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the young woman sitting alone at the far end of the feasting table. Thyra pulled her mother's blue woolen dress closer around her shoulders, the fabric soft from years of careful mending but plain compared to the rich silks and furs worn by the other maidens. The dress had been her mother's most treasured possession, woven with threads the color of summer skies, but here, among the warriors and their chosen companions, it marked her as surely as if she wore a beggar's rags. The Feast of Blot was the most important celebration in all the northern territories, when the strongest warriors gathered to honor the gods and seek worthy brides. For 3 days, the great hall would echo with boasts of conquest, the clash of drinking horns, and the laughter of couples spinning through ancient dances. It was a time when alliances formed, when bloodlines merged, and when a maiden's future could be decided by a single invitation to dance. Thyra had attended every year since her 16th winter, and every year she had watched the same ritual unfold. The warriors would enter first, their weapons gleaming in the firelight, their voices raised in songs of battle and glory. Then came the maidens, each more beautiful than the last, adorned in their family's finest treasures. The dancing would begin, and one by one the women would be chosen, swept away into the swirling crowd of celebration. But never Thyra. She was the daughter of Anya the healer, a woman who had died protecting their village from raiders 5 winters ago. Thyra had inherited her mother's gift with herbs and healing, but none of her beauty or grace. While other girls had golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, Thyra's was the red of autumn leaves, wild and untamable no matter how she tried to braid it. Where others had curves that drew admiring glances, she remained slender as a birch sapling. Most damning of all, she possessed her mother's gentle spirit in a world that valued only strength and conquest. The Kaiju, warriors of Vargstad, followed the old ways, believing that a man's worth was measured by the enemies he had slain and the treasures he had won in battle. They sought wives who could bear strong sons and manage great households filled with slaves and riches. What use had they for a quiet healer who lived alone in a cottage at the village's edge, growing herbs and tending to the sick? "Look at the mouse, sitting in her corner," laughed Astrid Goldenhair, the most sought-after maiden in all the northern kingdoms. Her voice carried clearly across the hall, designed to be heard above the music and revelry. Still wearing that old rag, as if fine cloth could make her anything more than what she is. The warriors around Astrid's table roared with laughter, their faces flushed with mead and cruel entertainment. These were men who had sailed to distant shores, who had faced death in battle and emerged victorious. They found sport in mocking those they saw as weak, as if cruelty could somehow add to their own strength. Thyra kept her eyes fixed on her untouched plate, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She had learned long ago that responding only made the torment worse. Better to endure in silence, to wait for the evening to end so she could return to the safety of her cottage and her healing work. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the laughter seemed sharper, the mockery more pointed. Perhaps it was because she had finally reached her 21st winter, the age when even the most patient families began to consider their daughters unmarriageable. Perhaps it was because this would likely be her last feast of blot as an unwed maiden. After this, she would join the ranks of the spinsters and widows, respected for their skills but forever apart from the great dance of courtship and marriage. At the high table, Jarl Magnus raised his drinking horn and called for attention. He was a man in his middle years, his beard streaked with silver, but his arms still thick with muscle from his warrior days. Magnus had ruled Vargstad for 15 winters, ever since the previous Jarl had died in a raid against the Saxon kingdoms. He was known as a fair leader, one who valued strength but also wisdom, and his word was law throughout the territory. "Friends and kinsmen," Magnus called out, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We gather tonight as our fathers did, and their fathers before them, to honor the gods and celebrate the bonds that make us strong. Let the young men prove their worth, and let the young women choose wisely, for from tonight's unions may come the heroes who will defend our lands in years to come." The crowd cheered, drinking horns raised high in salute. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and the dancing began in earnest. Thyra watched as couple after couple took to the floor, their movements graceful and practiced, their faces bright with joy and possibility. That was when she noticed him. Jorund Bearblood sat at a table, near the Jarl's, but his massive frame made him impossible to miss even in the crowded hall. He was a giant among men, standing head and shoulders above even the tallest warriors, his broad shoulders straining against his finest tunic. His hair was the color of dark honey, braided with silver rings that caught the firelight, and his beard was full and carefully groomed. Across his back hung Skull Splitter, the war axe that had become legend throughout the 9 kingdoms. Jorund was perhaps the most feared warrior in all the north. Men spoke his name in whispers, telling tales of his prowess in battle that grew more fantastical with each telling. It was said he had slain 12 men in single combat, that he had sailed to the edge of the world and returned with treasure beyond imagining. His call sign among the Vikings was Bearblood, because he fought with the fury of a great bear protecting its cubs, and because it was said his enemy's blood stained the ground so thick it looked black in the moonlight. Yet as Thyra watched him, she saw something unexpected. While the other warriors boasted loudly of their conquests, Jorund sat quietly, nursing a single horn of mead that had barely been touched. His grey eyes held a weariness that spoke of too many battles, too many friends lost to war and violence. When the others laughed at crude jokes or cruel mockery, his expression remained thoughtful, almost sad. She had noticed this about him before, in the rare times their paths had crossed in the village. Other warriors swaggered through the streets, demanding attention and respect through force of personality. Jorund moved quietly, speaking only when spoken to, treating even the lowliest thralls with courtesy and respect. It was as if the fearsome reputation he carried was a burden rather than a source of pride. "The bear blood grows soft in his old age," sneered Ulf Ironarm, a young warrior eager to make his reputation. "See how he sits apart from the celebration, brooding like an old woman. Perhaps he fears the dance floor more than he fears the battlefield." Several warriors laughed at this jest, but their mirth had a nervous edge. Even in mockery, none dared speak too boldly about Jorund Bearblood. His reputation was built on too many witnessed deeds, too many proven victories. Eric the Bold, Jorund's closest friend and battle companion, glanced meaningfully at the young warrior. "Careful with your tongue, boy," he said mildly. "The Bearblood may be quiet tonight, but that axe of his has drunk deep of louder men's blood." The warning was delivered with a smile, but Ulf fell silent nonetheless, turning his attention back to his drinking horn with newfound focus on its contents. Thyra found herself wondering what thoughts occupied Jorund's mind as he sat apart from the celebration. Did he, like her, feel out of place among all this revelry? Did he long for something beyond the endless cycle of raid and conquest that defined a warrior's life? She had heard that he owned land now, a farmstead in the green valleys beyond Vargstad, where he spent his winters when not sailing with raiding parties. Perhaps he dreamed of a quieter life, of seasons marked by planting and harvest rather than by battle and bloodshed. The music swelled and more couples joined the dance. Astrid moved gracefully through the steps, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner, her every movement calculated to draw admiring glances. She had already received 3 invitations to dance, each from a warrior of significant reputation and wealth. By evening's end, she would likely have her choice of marriage proposals. But as the festivities continued around her, Thyra felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over her shoulders like a cloak. She was a part of this gathering only in the most technical sense, present but not truly included, watching life unfold around her like a story told in a language she could never quite understand. Tomorrow, she would return to her cottage and her healing work. She would gather herbs in the forest, tend to the village's sick and wounded, and find satisfaction in the small ways she could ease suffering and bring comfort. It was a good life, she told herself, a meaningful one. She didn't need the approval of warriors or the validation of marriage to find purpose. But tonight, surrounded by laughter and music and the bright possibility of young love, she couldn't quite convince her heart that solitude was enough. The evening was still young, and already she knew how it would end. The dancing would continue until the late hours, couples pairing off for private conversations and promises of future meetings. The warriors would grow louder and more boastful as the mead flowed, and the mockery directed at those like her would grow sharper and more cruel. Eventually, she would slip away unnoticed, walking home alone under the northern stars, her mother's blue dress her only companion. It had always been thus, and she had accepted it as the natural order of things. But acceptance, she was learning, did not make the pain any less sharp, or the longing any less real. The torches continued to flicker, the music continued to play, and Thyra continued to wait for an evening that would never come, in a world that seemed to have no place for gentle souls who dreamed of something more than endless war. The laughter reached its crescendo as Astrid raised her drinking horn in a mock toast. "To our little mouse," she declared, her voice cutting through the music like a blade. "May she always find comfort in her corner, since no man will offer her his arm." The warriors around her table erupted in cruel mirth, some pounding their fists on the wooden planks so hard the cups jumped. Even some of the other maidens giggled behind their hands, grateful that the mockery was directed elsewhere. Thyra felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her gaze fixed downward, willing herself to become invisible. "Perhaps we should find her a dancing partner," suggested Ulf Ironarm, emboldened by the crowd's response. "My thrall Eric the Lame has been without a woman for months. They would make a fine pair, the mouse and the cripple." The suggestion drew another wave of laughter, and now more of the hall's attention was turning toward their corner. Thyra could feel dozens of eyes upon her, some amused, others merely curious to see how the sport would unfold. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the fabric of her mother's dress, drawing what comfort she could from the worn wool. "Leave the poor thing be," called out one of the older warriors, though his tone held more amusement than genuine sympathy. "She's harm to no one, sitting there quiet as a church mouse." "Exactly," Astrid replied, her golden hair catching the torchlight as she turned to address the wider crowd. "Quiet as a mouse, dull as a stone, and about as appealing as last week's stew. I wonder that the Jarl even allows such creatures to attend the sacred feast." The mockery was growing bolder now, feeding on itself as cruel laughter often did. Warriors who had barely noticed Thyra before were now joining in the sport, each trying to craft a cleverer insult than the last. The musicians, sensing the shift in mood, let their music fade to a softer background melody. "At least she knows her place," laughed another warrior. "See how she sits apart, not presuming to join her betters on the dance floor. There's wisdom in knowing one's limitations." Thyra closed her eyes, breathing slowly through her nose as her mother had taught her during moments of pain or fear. She could endure this as she had endured it before. Words were just sounds, she told herself. They could not truly harm her unless she gave them power. But even as she repeated these comforting thoughts, she felt something breaking inside her chest, some last fragile hope finally cracking under the weight of public humiliation. That was when the sound stopped. Not the music. That continued its gentle melody, but the laughter, the cruel voices, the jeering comments. The silence fell so suddenly it seemed unnatural, as if some invisible hand had pressed itself over the mouth of every mocker in the hall. Thyra looked up in confusion, wondering what could have caused such an abrupt change, and saw Jorund Bearblood standing. The giant warrior had risen from his place at the table, his full height making him tower over every other person in the hall. His grey eyes held an expression that made even the bravest men step back. Not rage exactly, but something far more dangerous, cold, controlled displeasure. When Jorund was angry, men died. When he was disappointed, armies retreated. But this look was something else entirely, something that suggested the warriors around Astrid's table had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. "You speak of mice and stones," Jorund said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. Each word was precisely spoken without heat or hurry, which somehow made them more menacing than any shout. Strange words from men who hide behind numbers and need courage to torment a woman who has shown them no discourtesy. Ulf Ironarm's face drained of color. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then thought better of it and reached for his drinking horn instead. The other warriors suddenly found their food fascinating, unwilling to meet Jorund's steady gaze. "But perhaps," Jorund continued, stepping away from his table with the fluid grace that marked him as a true master of combat, "you speak from ignorance rather than cruelty. Perhaps you simply do not recognize worth when it sits quietly before you." The hall held its breath as Jorund walked across the open space, his boots echoing against the stone floor. Thyra watched in stunned disbelief as the most feared warrior in the northern kingdoms approached her table. This had to be some elaborate jest, some new form of humiliation she had not anticipated. Perhaps he meant to publicly demonstrate her unworthiness, to prove the mocker's point through dramatic contrast. But when he reached her table, Jorund did something that no one, least of all Thyra, had expected. He knelt. The sight of Jorund Bearblood, slayer of armies, conqueror of distant shores, kneeling before a village healer's daughter sent a shock through the hall that was almost physical in its intensity. Some of the warriors gasped aloud, others stared in slack-jawed amazement. Astrid's drinking horn slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the table as mead spilled across the wood. Jorund extended one massive, scarred hand toward Thyra, palm upward in the traditional gesture of invitation. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost tender, a tone no one in the hall had ever heard from him before. "Lady Thyra," he said, and in calling her lady, he granted her an honor that no one had ever offered. "I have danced with death on 100 battlefields. I have seen the face of the grave and walked away unmarked. But I confess, I've never danced for the pure joy of it, never moved to music for no reason other than the pleasure of the moment." He paused, his grey eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. "I've danced with death. I'd rather dance with you." The silence stretched so long that Thyra wondered if time itself had stopped. Her mind struggled to process what was happening, to understand why this legendary warrior would risk his reputation for someone like her. Her hand hovered inches from his, trembling with uncertainty and disbelief. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the hushed hall. Jorund's expression softened further, and for a moment his fearsome reputation fell away entirely, revealing something vulnerable and achingly human beneath. "There is nothing to understand, lady. Only a warrior who grows weary of war, asking a gentle soul if she might teach him a different kind of strength." Behind him, Thyra could see the faces of the crowd, some shocked, some confused, some beginning to show the first stirrings of a respect she had never expected to receive. Astrid looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her perfect composure shattered by the impossibility of what she was witnessing. Old Sven, the storyteller, keeper of the village's ancient lore, stepped forward from his place among the elders. His weathered face bore an expression of wonder and recognition, as if he was seeing the fulfillment of some half-remembered prophecy. He moved to the center of the hall, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "Long have the runestones spoken of this night," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Of a time when the gentle giant would kneel before wisdom, when strength would bow to compassion. The stones foretold that when the mightiest warrior chose gentleness over conquest, a new age would dawn for our people." The crowd stirred at these words, murmurs of amazement and speculation rippling through the hall. The Feast of Blot was a sacred time when the gods were said to move among mortals and shape the fate of kingdoms. If the ancient prophecies were being fulfilled, then this moment was far more significant than a simple invitation to dance. Thyra felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders, but also something simpler and more immediate. The warmth of human kindness offered freely, without expectation or condition. Whatever larger forces might be at work, this moment belonged to her and to the extraordinary man kneeling before her. With hands that shook only slightly, she placed her fingers in his palm. Jorund's smile transformed his entire face, banishing the cold distance that usually marked his features. As he rose and gently drew her to her feet, Thyra felt something shift in the very air around them. The mockery had been replaced by awe, the cruel laughter by respectful silence. Together, they walked toward the center of the hall, where couples had danced for generations. But tonight, for the first time, the dance floor would welcome not just beauty and wealth and noble blood, but also gentleness and healing and the quiet strength of a compassionate heart. The music swelled as if the gods themselves were celebrating, and Jorund Bearblood, slayer of armies, terror of the northern seas, took Thyra, the healer, in his arms and began to teach the world a new definition of courage. Dawn broke grey and cold over Vargstad, the northern wind carrying whispers of the night's unprecedented events through every cottage and hall. Thyra woke in her small home at the village's edge, her mother's blue dress carefully folded beside her bed, still carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and celebration. For a moment, she wondered if the entire evening had been an elaborate dream. Surely Jorund Bearblood had not truly knelt before her, had not danced with her while the entire hall watched in stunned silence. But the memory was too vivid, too real. She could still feel the warmth of his hands, still hear his voice speaking those impossible words. "I've danced with death. I'd rather dance with you." The dance itself had been brief, 3 songs at most, but it had changed everything. When he had finally escorted her back to her table with a formal bow that granted her the respect due to a jarl's daughter, the silence in the hall had been absolute. Now, as she moved about her morning routine, Thyra tried to make sense of what had happened. Outside her small cottage, she could hear the village stirring to life, but the usual sounds seemed different somehow. Hushed conversations that stopped when footsteps approached, hurried whispers that carried an undertone of excitement and disbelief. She was grinding herbs for a healing salve when the knock came at her door. Thyra's hands stilled on the mortar and pestle, her heart suddenly racing. Very few people ever visited her cottage, and those who did usually came seeking treatment for illness or injury. But this knock was different, firm and confident, yet somehow respectful. When she opened the door, Jorund Bearblood stood on her threshold. In the grey morning light, he seemed even larger than he had in the torch-lit hall, his broad shoulders blocking out much of the sky behind him. But his expression was gentle, almost uncertain, as if he feared he might be unwelcome. In his hands, he carried a small leather pouch that gave off the distinctive scent of medicinal herbs. Lady Thyra, he said, inclining his head in a slight bow. I hope I do not disturb your morning work. You're not disturbing anything, she managed, stepping back to allow him entry. Please come in. Her cottage was small and simply furnished, but clean and filled with the tools of her trade. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and wooden shelves lined the walls, holding clay pots and glass vials containing various remedies. A fire burned low in the central hearth, warming a copper kettle that filled the air with the scent of chamomile tea. Jorund had to duck his head to clear the door frame, and once inside, his presence seemed to fill the entire space. Yet he moved carefully, mindful of her belongings, and when she gestured toward a chair, he sat with surprising grace for such a large man. I came because of this, he said, holding up the leather pouch. An old wound that troubles me in the cold mornings. Eric suggested I might seek your counsel. Thyra accepted the pouch, recognizing immediately the inferior quality of the herbs within. Someone had sold him common weeds mixed with barely effective roots, the kind of remedy desperate people bought from traveling merchants who cared more for profit than healing. Who gave you this? She asked, examining the contents more closely. A trader from the eastern settlements. He claimed it would ease the pain of old battle wounds. Jorund's mouth quirked in a rueful smile. I begin to suspect I was deceived. You were cheated, Thyra said bluntly, then caught herself. You mean I was a fool to trust a stranger's promises over proven wisdom? Jorund said mildly. You would be correct. I know much about dealing death, but very little about preserving life. There was something in his tone that made Thyra look at him more closely. In the soft morning light, she could see lines around his eyes that spoke of pain as well as age, and when he shifted in his chair, she caught the slight wince that suggested old injuries still troubled him. May I see the wound? She asked, professional concern overriding her nervousness. Without hesitation, Jorund pushed back his sleeve, revealing a forearm marked by an old sword cut that had healed poorly. The scar was thick and twisted, and Thyra could see how the damaged muscles would ache in cold weather. This should have been cleaned and stitched properly when it was fresh, she said, running gentle fingers along the damaged tissue. How long ago did this happen? 3 winters passed during a raid on the Saxon coast. The ship's healer was killed early in the battle, and by the time we returned home, he shrugged. I was fortunate it did not fester and kill me. Thyra moved to her shelves, selecting various herbs and preparations with practiced efficiency. As she worked, she found herself stealing glances at her unexpected patient. This close, she could see that Jorund's fearsome reputation came at a cost. His hands were marked by countless small scars, and when he moved, she could detect the careful way he held himself that suggested other old injuries. You carry a heavy burden, she said softly as she began preparing a proper remedy. All those battles, all that violence, it marks a man, doesn't it? Jorund was quiet for a long moment, watching her work with apparent fascination. I've been thinking much the same lately, he finally admitted. There was a time when I believed strength could only be proven through conquest, that a man's worth was measured by the fear he inspired in his enemies. He paused, but last night, watching you sit quietly while fools mocked what they could not understand, I saw a different kind of strength, one I find myself wanting to learn. Thyra's hand stilled as she processed his words. I'm not strong, she said. I just endure. Endurance without bitterness, grace under persecution, healing rather than harming. These are not small things, Lady Thyra. They are the foundations upon which lasting peace is built. She resumed her work, mixing the herbs with practiced skill. But her mind was reeling. That Jorund Bearblood would speak of peace, would see value in gentleness. It challenged everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. There, she said, holding up a small clay pot filled with a sweet-smelling salve. Apply this morning and evening, and the pain should ease within a few days. The scar will always remain, but it need not cause you suffering." As Jorund accepted the remedy, his fingers brushed hers, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "What payment would you ask for this healing?" Thyra shook her head. "None. Healing is a gift, not a trade." "Then I'm in your debt," he said solemnly, "and I do not forget my debts." Outside, the sound of approaching voices reached them, loud, masculine laughter that had an edge of mockery to it. Jorund's expression darkened as he recognized the voices of the warriors who had tormented Thyra the night before. "It seems word of my visit has spread," he said grimly, moving toward the window to observe the approaching group. Through the small opening, Thyra could see Ulf Ironarm and several other young warriors gathered near her cottage, their voices carrying clearly in the still morning air. "The mighty Bearblood, visiting the mouse in her hole," Ulf was saying, loud enough to be heard inside. "What kind of warrior wastes his time with such creatures?" Jorund's hand moved instinctively toward where his axe would normally hang, but today he had come unarmed, seeking healing rather than conflict. Thyra saw the tension in his shoulders and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "Words cannot harm us unless we give them power." But even as she spoke the comforting words her mother had taught her, Thyra knew that something fundamental had changed. The mockery would be worse now, the isolation more complete. By choosing to help her, Jorund had made her a target for every warrior who resented his reputation and sought to prove their own courage through cruelty. The voices outside grew louder, more pointed, and Thyra realized that her peaceful morning, perhaps her peaceful life, was coming to an end. The mockery outside Thyra's cottage grew bolder as more warriors gathered, their voices carrying the particular cruelty that comes from pack mentality. Jorund's jaw tightened as he listened to their crude speculation about his motives for visiting the village healer. "Perhaps the great Bearblood has grown too soft for real women," Ulf Ironarm suggested, his words drawing raucous laughter from his companions. "Maybe he needs someone meek and grateful, someone who won't expect a true warrior's strength." Without warning, Jorund strode to the door and threw it open. The laughter died instantly as the warriors found themselves facing the full intensity of his displeasure. In the morning light, with his gray eyes cold as winter storms, he looked every inch the legendary warrior whose name was whispered across 9 kingdoms. "You have something to say to me, Ulf?" Jorund's voice was deceptively calm, the tone he used before ending a battle with swift, brutal efficiency. The young warrior took an involuntary step backward, his face paling as he realized his jest had reached the ears of its target. Around him, his companions suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting away from the confrontation like snow before flame. "I meant no offense, Bearblood," Ulf stammered, his bravado evaporating. "We were merely wondering at your choice of company." "My choice of company," Jorund repeated slowly, advancing a single step. "You question my judgment?" Behind him, Thyra appeared in the doorway, her gentle presence a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the air. "Please," she said softly, though her voice carried clearly in the sudden silence. "There's no need for conflict." Jorund's expression softened slightly at her words, but his gaze never left Ulf's face. "The lady speaks wisdom," he said. "She shows more honor in a single word than you have displayed in all your strutting and posturing." He paused, letting the insult sink in. "Walk away, boy, while you still can." Ulf's face flushed red with humiliation, but he was not entirely foolish. After a moment's internal struggle between pride and self-preservation, he gave a curt nod and retreated, his remaining companions trailing behind him like chastened dogs. Jorund watched until they disappeared around a bend in the path, then turned back to Thyra with an expression of profound regret. "Forgive me," he said. "My presence has brought you trouble you do not deserve." "You defended my honor," Thyra replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "No one has ever done that before. Your honor needs no defense from me. It stands on its own merit." Jorund's voice grew gentle again, the cold warrior's mask falling away. "But I fear my attention will make your life more difficult. These men are not brave enough to challenge me directly, but they may seek easier targets for their wounded pride." Thyra nodded, understanding the reality of their situation. In defending her, Jorund had elevated her status, but he had also made her a symbol of his supposed weakness. Every warrior seeking to prove himself would now see her as a way to diminish the great Bearblood's reputation. "Walk with me," Jorund said suddenly, extending his arm in formal invitation. "If we must weather their disapproval, let us at least give them something worth disapproving of." Thyra hesitated only a moment before accepting his offered arm. Together, they walked through the village, their presence drawing stares and whispered conversations from every doorway and window. But something had changed in the quality of attention. Where before Thyra had been invisible or mocked, now she walked beside the most feared warrior in the northern kingdoms, and that changed everything. They made their way to the sacred grove at the village's heart, where the great oak stood that had witnessed 1,000 years of Vargstad's history. Here, beneath the ancient branches, Jorund stopped and turned to face her. "There is something I must tell you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Something I've shared with no one, not even Eric." Thyra waited, sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. "I'm tired," Jorund said simply. "Tired of war, tired of death, tired of being the instrument of other men's ambitions. For 20 years, I've sailed with raiding parties, have fought in battles whose causes I barely understood, have killed men who were probably no worse than myself." He looked down at his scarred hands. "I own land now, good farmland in the green valleys beyond the mountains. I could live there peacefully, raising crops instead of armies, healing the earth instead of spilling blood upon it." "What stops you?" Thyra asked gently. "Fear," he admitted with startling honesty. "Fear that without war, without the reputation of the Bearblood, I am nothing, that all I know how to do is destroy." He met her eyes. "But watching you last night, seeing how you heal rather than harm, how you endure without becoming bitter, you make me believe there might be another way." From within his tunic, Jorund withdrew something that made Thyra's breath catch in her throat. It was a pendant of silver worked in the shape of Thor's hammer, but this was no ordinary piece of jewelry. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the silver had the deep luster that spoke of great age and careful preservation. "This was my father's," Jorund said, holding the pendant with reverent care. "And his father's before him. It has been worn by the men of my line for 7 generations, passed down from father to son as a symbol of strength and honor." He paused, his voice growing rough with emotion. "I have no son to inherit it, and I begin to think I may never have one. But perhaps it might find a different kind of purpose." With infinite care, he placed the pendant around Thyra's neck, the weight of silver and history settling against her heart. The act was deeply significant in their culture. Such a gift spoke of serious courtship intentions, of a man's desire to bind his life to a woman's. "Jorund," Thyra whispered, touching the pendant with trembling fingers. I cannot. People will think exactly what I intend them to think," he said firmly. "That I am courting you with honorable intentions. That I value your gentleness above all the gold and glory in the world." The implications of his gift were staggering. By publicly claiming her as his intended, Jorund was not only elevating her status, but also making a statement about what he valued. It was a rejection of the warrior culture's emphasis on conquest and a declaration that he found worth in healing and compassion. As the reality of the moment settled around them, Thyra felt a shift in her understanding of the world. For 21 years, she had accepted her place on the margins of society, believing herself unworthy of the attention and affection that seemed to come so easily to others. But here stood a man who could have his choice of any woman in the northern kingdoms, and he had chosen her. "The village will be in uproar," she said softly. "Let them rage," Jorund replied, drawing her closer. "I have fought dragons and demons, conquered distant shores, and faced death without flinching. I will not be cowed by the opinions of lesser men." Above them, the ancient oak's branches swayed in the wind, and for the first time in her life, Thyra felt the stirring of something she had never dared hope for, the possibility that she might be loved, not despite her gentleness, but because of it. As they stood together in the sacred grove, the pendant heavy and warm against her heart, Thyra began to believe that perhaps the old prophecies were true. Perhaps a new age was indeed dawning, one where strength would be measured not by the enemies one killed, but by the lives one chose to heal. 3 days had passed since Jorund had gifted Thyra his father's pendant, and the village buzzed with speculation and gossip. Some whispered that the great Bearblood had finally lost his mind, choosing a common healer over the noble daughters who would have welcomed his suit. Others spoke of ancient prophecies and divine intervention, claiming the gods themselves had orchestrated this unlikely pairing. But all agreed that something fundamental had shifted in the order of things. Thyra had noticed the change immediately. Where once she had been ignored or mocked, now people watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The pendant at her throat marked her as under Jorund's protection, and even her harshest critics dared not speak openly against her while she wore the symbol of his intentions. But with elevated status came new dangers. She was gathering medicinal herbs in the forest beyond the village when the attack came. Jorund had insisted on morning walks as part of his recovery from old wounds, and they had fallen into a comfortable routine of meeting at dawn to explore the woodland paths together. This morning, however, he had been delayed by a summons from Jarl Magnus, leaving Thyra to venture into the woods alone. The arrow came from nowhere, a whisper of death that buried itself in the oak tree beside her head. If she had not bent to examine a patch of rare moss at that exact moment, the poisoned tip would have found her heart instead of harmless wood. Thyra froze, her healer's training warring with pure terror as she stared at the quivering shaft. The arrow was well made, its fletching indicating a skilled archer, but what chilled her blood was the dark stain on its tip, a coating that could only mean poison. "Do not move, little mouse." The voice came from somewhere among the trees, distorted by distance and the speaker's obvious attempt to disguise it. "That arrow was meant as a warning. The next one will find its mark." Thyra's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to think clearly. The archer was positioned somewhere to her left, probably elevated for a better shot. The undergrowth was thick enough to provide concealment for her attacker, but also offered multiple escape routes if she could reach it. "What do you want?" she called out, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "To deliver a message," came the reply. "The Bearblood's protection means nothing here. His weakness for broken things will be his downfall, and yours. Leave Vargstad before the new moon, or discover how easily healers can be made to need healing themselves." The threat was clear, but something about the voice nagged at Thyra's memory. She had heard it before, she was certain, though the disguise made identification impossible. Whoever wanted her gone was someone close enough to know her routines, someone who had access to quality weapons and poison. A second arrow thudded into the ground near her feet, close enough that she could smell the acrid scent of the venom coating its tip. This time, she recognized the poison. Nightshade extract, concentrated and deadly. Her attacker had significant knowledge of toxins, suggesting either a healer's training or access to someone with such knowledge. "Consider this your final warning, Mouse. The great Bearblood cannot protect you from shadows." The sound of retreating footsteps crashed through the underbrush, growing fainter as her attacker fled. Thyra remained frozen for several minutes, listening for any sign of return, before finally daring to move. Her hands shook as she examined the arrows, careful not to touch the poisoned tips. By the time she reached the village, word of her adventure had somehow preceded her. Jorund was waiting at her cottage, his face a mask of controlled fury that reminded everyone why men called him Bearblood. When he saw her approaching safely, relief flooded his features, followed immediately by cold determination. "Who?" he asked simply, examining the arrows she carried. "I don't know." The voice was disguised, but Thyra hesitated, then continued. "It was someone who knows me, knows my routines, someone with access to quality weapons and deadly poison." Eric the Bold emerged from behind Jorund's massive frame, his expression equally grim. "The poison is nightshade concentrate," he observed, studying the dark staining on the arrow tips. "Expensive to obtain, difficult to prepare properly. Not the work of a common cutthroat." "This suggests planning," Jorund said, his voice deadly quiet. "Someone has been watching, learning your habits, preparing for the perfect opportunity." His grey eyes met hers. "They chose to act when I was called away by the Jarl. That is not coincidence." The implications sent a chill through Thyra that had nothing to do with the morning air. If someone had deliberately arranged for Jorund to be elsewhere during the attack, it meant the conspiracy reached high into the village's power structure. Only Jarl Magnus himself had the authority to summon Jorund away from his chosen duties. "You think Magnus is involved?" Eric asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "I think someone wants us to think that," Jorund replied carefully. "Too convenient, too obvious. But it means our enemy has access to the Jarl's household, can predict or influence his decisions." He turned to Thyra. "You will not walk alone again. Not until we know who wants you dead." As if summoned by their conversation, Jarl Magnus himself appeared at the cottage door, his face bearing an expression of concern that seemed genuine. "I heard there was trouble in the forest," he said, his gaze taking in the evidence of the attack. "Are you harmed, Lady Thyra?" The formal address was new. Before Jorund's courtship, Magnus had barely acknowledged her existence. Now she was Lady Thyra, elevated by association, if not by birth. "Unharmed but shaken," she replied carefully. "Someone seems to object to my presence in Vargstad." Magnus examined the arrows with the eye of a man who had seen much violence in his years as Jarl. "Professional work," he concluded. "Not the crude attempt of some jealous suitor. This speaks of serious intent and significant resources." He looked up at Jorund. "You have made enemies by your choice of bride, my friend. Some may seek to strike at you through her." "Let them try," Jorund said simply. "But they will discover that threatening what I protect is a mistake they will not live to repeat." Magnus nodded approvingly. "Good. But we must also consider that this attack may be about more than personal vendetta. The old prophecies speak of change coming to our people, of new ways replacing old. There are those who would resist such change with violence." Old Sven the storyteller had appeared during their conversation, drawn by the crowd gathering around Thyra's cottage. His weathered face was grave as he studied the poisoned arrows. "The rune stones warned of this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "They spoke of those who would seek to prevent the fulfillment of destiny through treachery and death. The gentle giant and the healer must face trials that will test not only their love, but their resolve to change the way of things." "Prophecy or not," Jorund said firmly, "Thyra's safety is my responsibility now. I will not fail in that duty." But even as he spoke the words with absolute conviction, Thyra could see the worry in his grey eyes. This attack had been carefully planned and expertly executed. Only chance had saved her life, and their enemy had demonstrated both skill and ruthlessness. As the crowd dispersed and the immediate crisis passed, one question remained unanswered. If someone was willing to commit murder to prevent their union, what other horrors were they prepared to unleash? The forest held its secrets, and somewhere among those shadows, their enemy was already planning the next move in a game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. The attack in the forest had changed everything. Where once Thyra had moved freely through Vargstad, now she found herself constantly accompanied by either Jorund or Eric, their protective presence a reminder of the danger that stalked her. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move in a deadly game whose rules no one fully understood. It was Eric who brought the forged message to Jorund's attention 3 days later. The parchment bore the seal of Jarl Hakon of the Iron Shore, a neighboring territory with whom Vargstad had maintained uneasy peace for many years. The message was urgent, claiming that Saxon raiders had been spotted moving toward the northern settlements and requesting Jorund's immediate assistance in planning their defense. "The timing troubles me," Eric said, studying the document with suspicious eyes. "Why would Hakon summon you specifically? He has his own warriors, his own battle-tested leaders." Jorund examined the seal carefully, noting the quality of the parchment and the formal language of the message. Everything appeared authentic, yet something felt wrong about the entire situation. "The seal looks genuine," he admitted, "but the hand that wrote this is not Hakon's usual scribe. The letters are formed differently, more carefully, as if someone was concentrating on copying an unfamiliar style." Thyra looked up from her work, preparing healing supplies, a task that had become routine since the assassination attempt. "May I see it?" she asked. Jorund handed her the message, watching as she studied it with the same careful attention she gave to identifying medicinal plants. Her healing training had taught her to notice small details that others might miss, patterns and inconsistencies that could mean the difference between cure and poison. "The parchment is expensive," she observed, running her fingers along the edge. "But look here, there are traces of different ink on the bottom edge, as if something was written and then scraped away." She held the document up to the light streaming through the window. "And the seal, while well made, has been applied over a slight roughness in the parchment. Someone removed an original message and replaced it with this one." Eric's expression darkened. A forgery, then. But who would have access to Hakon's seal or knowledge of his scribe's writing style? The implications were troubling. Creating such a convincing forgery would require someone with intimate knowledge of diplomatic correspondence, someone who had access to official documents and possibly even genuine seals. It suggested a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple jealousy or wounded pride. "There's something else," Thyra continued, her voice growing more concerned. "The messenger who delivered this, I saw him in the square yesterday, speaking quietly with Astrid Goldenhair. They seemed very familiar with each other." Jorund and Eric exchanged meaningful glances. Astrid's behavior since the Feast of Blot had been increasingly erratic, her once confident demeanor replaced by something approaching desperation. She had made several attempts to approach Jorund directly, each more bold and inappropriate than the last, and her treatment of Thyra had grown coldly hostile. "We need to know more about Astrid's connections," Eric said grimly. "If she's involved in this conspiracy, she may be the key to uncovering who wants Thyra dead." But their investigation would have to wait. Even as they spoke, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears, and through the window they could see a party of riders approaching under Jarl Magnus's banner. The Jarl himself rode at their head, his expression grave as he dismounted at Jorund's door. "My friends," Magnus said as he entered, his voice carrying an unusual tension, "I bring troubling news from the coastal settlements. 3 of our outlying farms have been attacked in the past week, their livestock stolen and their grain stores burned. The survivors speak of raiders moving like ghosts in the night, striking without warning and vanishing before pursuit can be organized." The news sent a chill through the room. Such attacks were not uncommon during the raiding season, but the systematic nature of these assaults suggested something more organized than simple banditry. "Do we know who leads these raiders?" Jorund asked, his warrior's instincts immediately engaged by the tactical implications. "That's what troubles me most," Magnus replied. "The survivors describe men who fought with unusual coordination, as if they knew exactly what they were looking for and how to find it. They targeted specific resources: grain stores, breeding livestock, metalworking tools. These were not random raids for quick profit, but calculated strikes designed to weaken our ability to sustain ourselves through the winter. Eric frowned at this information. Someone with detailed knowledge of our settlement's layouts and resources. An outsider couldn't plan such precise attacks without inside information. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, voices raised in anger and what sounded like a struggle. Jorund moved immediately to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for his absent weapon. Since the attempt on Thyra's life, he had taken to wearing his war axe, even within the village. Through the glass, they could see Astrid Goldenhair in heated argument with old Sven the storyteller, her beautiful face twisted with an anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever disagreement had sparked the confrontation. Behind her stood several young warriors, including Ulf Ironarm, their expressions suggesting they were prepared to support her position with force if necessary. The old fool speaks of prophecies and destiny. Astrid's voice carried clearly through the evening air, pitched to be heard by the growing crowd of onlookers. But what good are ancient words when our people face real danger from real enemies? We need warriors focused on defending our lands, not wasting their strength on weak creatures who bring nothing but trouble. The insult was clearly directed at Thyra, though Astrid was careful not to name her directly. Old Sven's weathered face remained calm, but his voice carried the authority of one who had served as keeper of the village's law for more than 40 years. "You speak of strength and weakness as if you understand their meaning," he replied, his words falling into a sudden silence as more villagers gathered to witness the confrontation. "But the rune stones teach us that true strength often wears the mask of gentleness, and that the mightiest oaks sometimes grow from the smallest seeds." "Pretty words," Astrid shot back, "but words won't feed us when winter comes, and our stores are empty because our greatest warrior was distracted by a healer's daughter instead of protecting what matters." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Thyra felt the weight of every watching eye. In the growing twilight, with tension crackling between the gathered villagers, she realized that the careful balance of her new life was beginning to fracture. Magnus appeared troubled by this public display of dissent, his authority as Jarl challenged by the growing divisions within his community. "Enough," he said, stepping forward with the voice of command. "These are matters for the council to discuss, not for public argument in the streets." But Astrid was not finished. Her eyes found Thyra through the window, and the hatred in them was unmistakable. "Some problems," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "require more direct solutions than council debates." The threat was thinly veiled, and as the crowd began to disperse, Thyra understood that their enemy was no longer content to work from the shadows. The next phase of the conspiracy was beginning, and this time the danger would come not from hidden archers in the forest, but from the very heart of their community. Whatever forces opposed their union were preparing to make their final move, and Thyra feared that neither love nor prophecy would be enough to protect them from what was coming. The revelation came in the most unlikely of places: the ruins of Thyra's childhood home, a burned-out cottage at the village's eastern edge that had stood empty since her mother's death. Thyra had avoided the place for years, the memories too painful to bear, but Eric's investigation into the conspiracy had led them to search every possible hiding place for evidence of their enemy's plans. "Someone has been using this place," Eric observed, pointing to the recently disturbed ashes in the old hearth. "Fresh footprints, and look here, scratches in the stone where something heavy was dragged across the floor." Jorund knelt beside the hearth, his warrior's eye studying the patterns in the ash and debris. They moved something substantial. A chest, perhaps, or a box of documents. He looked up at Thyra. "What was here before? What would someone want from your mother's belongings?" Thyra's throat tightened as she surveyed the ruins of her former life. "Mother kept her healing supplies here, her books and records. But after she died, I moved everything useful to my cottage." She paused, memories stirring. There was one thing I never touched. A locked chest that Mother said contained nothing but old papers. Family records, she claimed, too boring for a child to bother with. "Where was this chest kept?" Eric asked, his voice sharp with interest. "Beneath the floorboards in the corner there." Thyra pointed to a section of the floor where several boards had been recently pried up and carelessly replaced. She showed me the hiding place when I was small, but warned me never to disturb it. Jorund and Eric exchanged glances before moving to examine the loose floorboards. With some effort, they lifted the damaged planks to reveal a rectangular space beneath. It was empty now, but the dust patterns clearly showed where a substantial container had rested for many years. "Gone," Eric said grimly, "but recently removed within the past few days." He studied the gouges in the surrounding wood. Whoever took it was in a hurry, careless about covering their tracks. As they prepared to leave the ruined cottage, a glint of metal caught Thyra's eye. Half hidden beneath a fallen timber, something gold gleamed in the fading afternoon light. She reached for it carefully, her fingers closing around a small piece of worked metal that made her blood run cold. It was a fragment of a crown, not the simple circlet of a minor jarl, but an ornate piece worked in gold and set with precious stones. Even damaged as it was, the craftsmanship spoke of royal authority, of power that extended far beyond a single village or territory. "Jorund," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look at this." The two men crowded close as she held up the fragment, its significance immediately apparent. Eric's face went pale as he recognized the distinctive knotwork pattern that decorated the gold. "That's the crown of Jarl Thorvald," he breathed. "I would recognize those markings anywhere. But Thorvald died in a Saxon raid 15 years ago, and his crown was lost with him." Thyra's world tilted as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. Thorvald had been her father's name, a name her mother had spoken only in whispers, usually accompanied by tears and warnings never to repeat what she heard. Anya the healer had been more than a simple village woman, and Thyra was far more than a healer's orphaned daughter. "My mother was Thorvald's wife," she said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "She fled here when he was killed, hiding both our identities to protect us from his enemies. That chest contained the proof, documents, royal seals, evidence of my legitimate claim to his lands and titles." The implications were staggering. If Thyra was truly Thorvald's daughter, then she was not merely a village healer, but the rightful heir to one of the most powerful jarls in the northern territories. Her father's lands had been vast, his influence extending across multiple settlements, and his death had left a power vacuum that ambitious men had rushed to fill. "Magnus," Jorund said, his voice heavy with realization. "He was one of Thorvald's captains, positioned to inherit leadership when your father died. If your claim became known, he would lose everything," Thyra finished. "His authority, his lands, his position, all of it legally mine by right of inheritance." Eric's expression grew dark as he pieced together the conspiracy. "Magnus has had 15 years to consolidate power, to make himself indispensable to the people who should rightfully follow you. He couldn't risk exposure, couldn't allow the truth to come out." The attacks on the outlying settlements suddenly made sense. Not random raids, but calculated strikes designed to create fear and demonstrate Magnus's indispensability as a military leader. The assassination attempt in the forest had been meant to eliminate the threat to his rule before it could fully develop. And Astrid has been his agent from the beginning, Thyra said, understanding flooding through her. "Positioned to watch and report, to identify potential threats to his authority. When Jorund showed interest in me, she must have realized the danger I represented." "But how could she have known your true identity?" Eric asked. "You said your mother never spoke of it openly." Thyra's mind raced through childhood memories, half-remembered conversations and careful warnings. Mother spoke to someone occasionally. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep. A woman's voice, someone she trusted with the truth. Her eyes widened with horrifying realization. Astrid's mother, Sigrid Goldenhair. They were friends before I was born, before Mother came to Vargstad. Sigrid knew the truth and she passed it to her daughter. The conspiracy was far more extensive than they had imagined, involving not just Magnus and Astrid, but potentially dozens of others who had profited from the deception. For 15 years, they had lived comfortably on lands and authority that rightfully belonged to Thyra, and they would kill to protect their stolen prosperity. "We need to get back to the village," Jorund said urgently. "If they know we've discovered the truth, they'll move against us immediately. Magnus can't afford to let this information spread." But as they emerged from the ruined cottage, they found their path blocked by a group of armed warriors led by Magnus himself. The Jarl's face bore an expression of profound regret, but his hand rested on the hilt of his sword in a gesture that left no doubt about his intentions. "I'd hoped it wouldn't come to this," Magnus said, his voice heavy with what might have been genuine sorrow. "You were supposed to die quietly in the forest, a tragic accident that would end the threat without revealing the larger truth. But you've proven remarkably difficult to kill." Behind him, Astrid stepped into view, her beautiful face twisted with hatred and desperation. 15 years I've watched and waited, reporting every detail of her pathetic life to ensure she never became a threat. And then you, she pointed accusingly at Jorund, had to play the noble hero, elevating her above her station and drawing attention to what should have remained hidden. "The people have a right to know their true leader," Jorund said, his hand moving to rest on Skullsplitter's handle. "Thyra is Thorvald's legitimate heir, and no amount of murder will change that fact." Magnus laughed bitterly. "Legitimate heir to what? Thorvald's lands are prosperous under my leadership, his people content and well protected. What could she offer them? Healing herbs and gentle words. The northern kingdoms require strength, not sentiment." "Strength without honor is mere brutality," Thyra said, finding her voice despite the terror coursing through her veins. "My father understood that. It's why his people followed him willingly, why his death left such a void that you've spent 15 years trying to fill." The truth of her words stung, and Magnus's expression hardened. "Pretty speeches will not save you now. You know too much, and there are too many witnesses to allow you to live." He drew his sword, its steel gleaming in the dying light. "I offer you one mercy, a quick death instead of the lingering torment I had originally planned." As the armed warriors closed in around them, Thyra understood that the time for hiding and deception had ended. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, the truth of her identity would no longer remain buried beneath lies and murder. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate test of whether love and justice could triumph over ambition and deceit. The confrontation at the ruined cottage might have ended in bloodshed if not for the intervention of old Sven, whose ancient voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. The storyteller emerged from the forest shadows as if summoned by the weight of destiny itself, carrying in his gnarled hands an artifact that made even Magnus step back in recognition. It was the war horn of Vargstad, carved from the tusk of a great mammoth and bound with silver rings that bore the names of every jarl who had ruled the territory since the founding days. According to ancient law, whoever sounded the horn could demand a formal gathering of all free men to witness matters of justice and succession. "Magnus Thorson," Sven said, his weathered voice carrying the authority of one who had served 7 jarls in his long lifetime. "You stand accused of murder, theft, and usurpation of rightful authority. By the old laws, the blood of Thorvald calls for justice, and justice shall be heard by all the people." The horn's deep, resonant call echoed across the valley as Sven raised it to his lips, its sound carrying for miles in the still evening air. By ancient tradition, all who heard the call were bound to gather at the sacred stones before the next sunrise, and there the matter would be decided according to the oldest laws of their people. Magnus's face darkened with frustrated rage, but even he dared not defy the formal summons. To do so would mark him as an oath-breaker before gods and men, destroying any legitimacy his rule might claim. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "Let the people judge between us, but know this, old man. They will choose strength over sentiment, proven leadership over the dreams of children." As the various groups separated to prepare for the morrow's trial, Thyra found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity she barely understood. The formal challenge would follow ancient protocols, with speakers presenting evidence and witnesses testifying before the assembled community. But the ultimate resolution would likely come down to trial by combat, and that meant she would need a champion. "I will stand for you," Jorund said without hesitation as they returned to her cottage. "By right of courtship and by choice of the heart, I claim the privilege of defending your honor and your claim." But Eric shook his head grimly. "Magnus won't face you himself. He's too smart for that. He'll choose a champion, probably one of the young warriors eager to prove themselves by defeating the legendary Bearblood. Ulf Ironarm, most likely, or one of the other ambitious fools who see this as their chance for glory." The politics of the situation were more complex than simple combat, however. Word of the challenge was already spreading throughout the territory, carried by riders who had heard the horn's call. By morning, representatives from neighboring settlements would arrive to witness the proceedings, making this not just a local matter, but a test of legitimacy that could affect the entire region's balance of power. Thyra spent the evening in preparation, both practical and spiritual, gathering her mother's hidden documents that Sven had secretly preserved, studying the formal protocols she would need to follow, and struggling to accept the transformation of her identity from village healer to rightful ruler. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, not just for her own fate, but for the hundreds of people whose lives would be affected by the morning's outcome. "I don't know how to be a leader," she confessed to Jorund as they sat together in the small cottage that had been her entire world until so recently. "I know healing, I know herbs and remedies and how to ease suffering, but ruling, making decisions that affect entire communities, I have no training for such things." Jorund took her hands in his, the contrast between his warrior's scars and her, healer's gentle touch, somehow symbolizing the challenge they faced. "Your father was a great leader, not because he was the strongest warrior, but because he understood that true authority comes from serving those who follow you. You've been doing that your entire life. Healing the sick, helping the poor, asking nothing in return. That's the foundation of rightful rule." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Astrid Goldenhair stood on the threshold, but the proud beauty of previous days was gone, replaced by a woman consumed by desperate fear. Her golden hair hung loose and uncombed, her fine clothes wrinkled and stained, and her eyes held the wild look of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you, about tomorrow, about the trial. There are things you don't understand, things Magnus hasn't told you." Jorund's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but Thyra gestured for him to wait. Something in Astrid's manner suggested not treachery, but genuine terror, the desperation of someone who saw destruction approaching and sought any possible escape. "Speak," Thyra said simply. Astrid glanced around nervously before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Magnus has no intention of allowing this trial to proceed fairly," she said, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. "He's arranged for hired killers to attack during the proceedings to create chaos that will allow him to claim you were killed by unknown enemies. He plans to blame raiders, to use the confusion to eliminate not just you, but anyone who supports your claim." The revelation sent a chill through the room. If Magnus was prepared to resort to outright slaughter during a sacred trial, then he had abandoned any pretense of legitimacy in favor of pure survival. "Why are you telling us this?" Eric asked suspiciously. "What do you gain by betraying him now?" Astrid's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as the weight of 15 years of deception overwhelmed her. "Because I'm tired of being his tool, tired of watching good people suffer for his ambition. I thought if I served him faithfully, If I helped him maintain power, he would eventually make me his wife. But I know now that I was just another pawn, useful only as long as I could provide information and do his bidding." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small leather pouch, its contents clinking softly as she set it on the table. "These are the keys to the chains Magnus has prepared for the hired killers. He plans to release them during your speech, when the crowd's attention is focused on you. They'll strike from multiple directions, creating panic while his loyal warriors move to protect him and eliminate witnesses." The tactical implications were sobering. Even with advance warning, they would be vastly outnumbered, and fighting to protect not just themselves, but hundreds of innocent civilians who had come to witness what they believed would be a lawful trial. "There's more," Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed fully to her confession. "Magnus has been poisoning the grain supplies to create the illusion of external threats. The raids on the outlying settlements were carried out by his own men, disguised to look like foreign attackers. He's been systematically weakening the territory's defenses while consolidating power in his own hands." This final revelation completed the picture of Magnus's treachery. Not only had he usurped Thyra's rightful inheritance, but he had actively harmed the people he claimed to protect, creating false threats to justify his continued authority. "What would you have us do with this information?" Jorund asked, studying Astrid with the calculating gaze of a master strategist. "Even knowing his plans, we face overwhelming odds." "There are those among the warriors who have grown suspicious of Magnus's leadership," Astrid replied. "Men who remember Thorvald with respect, who have noticed inconsistencies in the stories of recent attacks. If you can reach them before the trial begins, if you can present evidence of Magnus's deception—" "A counter-conspiracy," Eric mused. "Turn Magnus's own supporters against him by revealing the truth of his actions. Risky, but it might be our only chance." As they planned through the night, messengers slipping quietly through the darkness to reach potential allies, Thyra felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who looked to Vargstad for protection and guidance. The sacred stones had witnessed countless trials over the centuries, but few had carried such significance. By sunset tomorrow, either justice would be restored to the northern territories, or tyranny would triumph through violence and deception. In the distance, the first glimmers of dawn were beginning to show on the horizon, and with them came the ultimate test of everything Thyra had learned about strength, courage, and the power of truth to overcome even the darkest conspiracies. The horn's call had been sounded, the ancient laws invoked, and there was no turning back. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, the time for hiding was over, and the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The sacred judgment stones of Vargstad had stood for 1,000 years, 5 massive granite monoliths arranged in a perfect circle that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless leaders. As dawn broke over the valley, the ancient site filled with people from across the territory, jarls and thralls, warriors and craftsmen, farmers and traders, all drawn by the horn's call to witness what many sensed would be a moment that defined their future. Thyra stood at the eastern stone, the traditional position for one making, formal claim to leadership, wearing her mother's blue dress, but also the crown fragment that had been recovered and hastily repaired overnight. The simple circlet of gold felt impossibly heavy on her head, weighted not just with precious metal, but with the expectations of generations. Across the circle, Magnus took his place at the western stone, resplendent in his finest armor and surrounded by his loyal warriors. His expression was confident, almost dismissive, as if he considered this entire proceeding merely a formality before resuming his interrupted rule. Old Sven stepped forward to serve as law speaker, his ancient voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "We gather in the sight of gods and men to hear matters of blood, honor, and rightful succession. Let the claimant speak first, as is the ancient custom." Thyra's mouth felt dry as dust as she stepped forward, but her voice remained steady as she began the formal words that would either restore her inheritance or condemn her to death. I am Thyra Thorvaldsdottir, rightful heir to the lands and title unlawfully held by Magnus Thorsson. I claim what is mine by blood and birth, and I demand justice for 15 years of deception and usurpation. A murmur ran through the crowd at the formal proclamation of her identity. Many had suspected the truth after the previous night's revelations, but hearing it spoken in the sacred circle gave it undeniable weight. Magnus stepped forward with theatrical confidence. I deny this claim as the ravings of a deluded girl, supported by forged documents and the desperate schemes of those who would destabilize our peaceful realm. I have ruled justly for 15 years, protecting our people and ensuring prosperity. What proof exists beyond wild accusations and convenient fragments of metal? It was the moment they had prepared for. Eric stepped forward, carrying a leather satchel containing the documents that Sven had secretly preserved, along with testimony from witnesses who had served under Thorvald. One by one, the evidence was presented. Marriage contracts, birth records, correspondence bearing official seals, and the sworn statements of men whose honor was beyond question. But Magnus was not without resources of his own. His supporters spoke eloquently of his achievements, the victories won and prosperity secured under his leadership. They painted Thyra as an untested girl whose gentle nature would invite conquest from stronger neighbors, whose rule would bring weakness and eventual destruction to their territory. The debate continued for hours, with representatives from neighboring lands offering their own testimony about Thorvald's legacy and Magnus's subsequent leadership. The crowd's mood shifted back and forth like a tide, influenced by the eloquence of each speaker and the weight of evidence presented. As the sun reached its zenith, the moment arrived that all had been dreading and anticipating. When matters of succession could not be resolved through debate and evidence alone, the ancient laws demanded trial by combat, single combat between champions representing each claimant. I call upon Jorund Bearblood to serve as my champion, Thyra declared, her voice carrying across the sacred circle. Let his strength and honor speak for the justice of my cause. Magnus smiled coldly as he made his own announcement. I choose Gunnar the Red, slayer of the Saxon champion, terror of the southern seas. The crowd gasped as Gunnar stepped forward. He was a giant of a man, nearly matching Jorund's height, but broader still, his arms thick as tree trunks, and his chest bearing the scars of 100 battles. His reputation was fearsome even by Viking standards, a berserker who fought without armor, trusting in his fury and his massive two-handed axe to overwhelm any opponent. An interesting choice, Jorund said mildly, studying his opponent with the calculating gaze of a master warrior. Tell me, Gunnar, do you fight for honor or for gold? Gunnar's response was a wordless roar that echoed off the standing stones, his battle fury already beginning to build. This was not a man who fought with strategy or finesse, but with pure, overwhelming violence that had crushed countless enemies through sheer, brutal force. The sacred circle was cleared as the two champions prepared for combat. According to ancient tradition, they would fight with weapon and shield until one yielded, was killed, or could no longer continue. There were no rules beyond this simple framework. Victory by any means was acceptable, and the gods would judge the righteousness of each cause through the outcome of the battle. As Jorund checked his weapons one final time, Thyra approached him with her healer's pouch. For strength, she said, offering him a small vial of herbal extract that would help sustain his energy through prolonged combat. Keep it, he replied gently. I fight not for potions or magic, but for love and justice. That is strength enough. The law speaker raised his staff, and the sacred circle fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the ancient stones. The clash of steel rang out across the sacred circle as Jorund's axe met Gunnar's massive blade in a shower of sparks. The berserker's first strike had been intended to end the fight immediately, a devastating overhead blow that would have split a lesser warrior in half. But Jorund's experience and skill allowed him to turn the attack aside at the last moment. Gunnar fought like a force of nature, his battle fury transforming him into something barely human. Spittle flew from his lips as he roared his war cries, his massive frame moving with surprising speed as he pressed his attack. Each swing of his two-handed axe carried enough force to shatter stone, and the crowd gasped as Jorund was driven back step by step around the sacred circle. But Jorund had not earned his reputation through raw strength alone. Where Gunnar relied on overwhelming force, the Bearblood fought with precision and tactical awareness, using his opponent's fury against him. Each wild swing left Gunnar slightly off balance, creating openings that a more experienced fighter could exploit. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, though the sun had moved only slightly in the sky. Jorund's strategy became clear as the fight progressed. He was letting Gunnar exhaust himself through uncontrolled aggression, waiting for the berserker's legendary fury to burn itself out. Several times he could have struck killing blows but held back, content to inflict minor wounds that would slowly sap his opponent's strength. Magnus watched from his position with growing concern. He had chosen Gunnar precisely because the berserker's reputation for unstoppable violence would intimidate both Jorund and the watching crowd. But the fight was not unfolding as expected, and the subtle murmurs from the audience suggested they were beginning to appreciate the skill and restraint Jorund displayed. "Finish him!" Magnus shouted, abandoning all pretense of neutrality. What kind of warrior toys with his prey? The taunt had an unexpected effect. Instead of spurring Gunnar to greater effort, it broke his concentration for just a moment, long enough for Jorund to step inside his guard and deliver a precise thrust that pierced the berserker's thigh. Gunnar stumbled, his perfect balance finally disrupted, and Jorund pressed his advantage with a series of calculated strikes that drove his opponent to his knees. But Gunnar was far from finished. With a roar that seemed to shake the very stones, he launched himself forward in a final, desperate assault, abandoning his weapon to grapple with Jorund directly. The two giants crashed to the ground, rolling across the sacred earth as they struggled for dominance. This was the kind of fighting Gunnar understood best, brutal, intimate, without finesse or honor. His massive hands closed around Jorund's throat, squeezing with the strength that had crushed the life from dozens of enemies. The crowd held its breath as the Bearblood struggles grew weaker. But Thyra had not spent years learning the healing arts without understanding anatomy. "The nerve cluster behind his left elbow," she called out, her knowledge of the body's vulnerable points guiding Jorund even in his extremity. Jorund's fingers found the spot she indicated, pressing with precise force against the nerve that controlled Gunnar's grip. The berserker's hands spasmed open, releasing their deadly hold just long enough for Jorund to break free and reverse their positions. What followed was not the savage beating that many expected, but something that left the crowd speechless. Instead of crushing Gunnar's windpipe or breaking his neck, Jorund simply held him pinned, applying just enough pressure to prevent escape without causing serious harm. "Yield," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You have fought bravely, but the cause you serve is unjust. There is no shame in recognizing truth." Gunnar's eyes, still wild with battle fury, gradually cleared as he realized his position. He could continue to struggle, but it would only result in his death or permanent injury. The man holding him down could have killed him a dozen times over during their fight, but had chosen mercy instead. "I yield," Gunnar gasped, the words clearly audible to every witness present. "The victory is yours, Bearblood." As Jorund released his opponent and helped him to his feet, a gesture of respect that drew approving murmurs from the crowd, Magnus's carefully controlled expression finally cracked. The trial by combat had not gone as planned, and worse, Jorund's display of strength tempered by mercy had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership that Thyra represented. "The gods have spoken," old Sven declared, his ancient voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Through trial by combat, the claim of Thyra Thorvaldsdottir is proven just and true. By right of blood and by judgment of the sacred stones, she is rightful heir to all her father's lands and titles. But even as the crowd began to cheer, Magnus was not finished, his face twisted with desperate fury as he realized that 15 years of careful deception were crumbling around him. Reaching beneath his cloak, he withdrew a hidden blade and lunged not at Jorund, but directly at Thyra herself. The coward's strike might have succeeded, but Astrid Goldenhair threw herself between them, taking the intended killing blow in her own body. As she collapsed, her sacrifice complete, her final words carried clearly across the sacred circle. "Forgive me, my lady. Let my death wash clean 15 years of shame." In that moment, as Magnus stood with blood on his hands, before the sacred stones and hundreds of witnesses, his illegitimate rule finally ended. Not through combat or debate, but through his own dishonorable actions that revealed his true nature to all. 3 months had passed since the trial at the sacred judgment stones, and the great hall of Vargstad had been transformed for a celebration unlike any the northern territories had witnessed in generations. Where once the space had echoed with the crude laughter of warriors mocking those they deemed weak, now it rang with genuine joy and the sounds of a community healing from years of deception and division. At the high table, Thyra sat wearing the wedding crown of intertwined silver and iron, a masterpiece crafted by the village's smith that had become the talk of every settlement within 100 miles. The crown was more than mere ornamentation. It was a symbol of the new order she and Jorund had established together. The silver represented the healing arts, wisdom, and compassion that she brought to leadership, while the iron spoke of the strength and protection that Jorund offered. Together, they formed something stronger and more beautiful than either metal alone could achieve. The ceremony itself had been a marvel, blending ancient traditions with innovations that reflected their shared vision for the future. Instead of the typical warrior's feast focused on conquest and plunder, the celebration honored healers alongside fighters, farmers beside sailors, and wisdom as much as strength. For the first time in living memory, the old and young, the mighty and humble, truly gathered as equals. Jorund, resplendent in his finest clothes, but notably without his fearsome war axe, looked more at peace than anyone had ever seen him. The transformation was remarkable. Where once the legendary Bearblood had carried himself with the cold distance of a professional killer, now he moved with the confident ease of a man who had found his true purpose. His new role as protector and guardian rather than conqueror suited him perfectly, and the gentleness that Thyra had awakened in him had become his greatest strength. "Never thought I'd see the day," Eric the Bold commented, raising his drinking horn in salute. The most feared warriors in the northern kingdoms, brought low by a healer's smile. "Not brought low," Jorund corrected with a warm laugh that would have been unthinkable during his days as the Bearblood. "Lifted up. There's a difference between conquest and victory, between taking what you want and earning what you deserve." The changes went far beyond the wedding celebration. In the 3 months since Magnus's downfall, Thyra had begun implementing reforms that addressed the systematic corruption and neglect that had plagued the territory under his rule. The poisoned grain stores had been replaced with healthy seed, the false threats that had terrorized outlying settlements had been exposed and ended, and a new system of justice had been established that valued healing and restoration over punishment and revenge. Most remarkably, the integration of healing wisdom into governance had begun to influence neighboring territories. Delegations from distant jarls had arrived to study Thyra's methods, particularly her innovation of including healers and wise women in the traditional councils of war chiefs and property holders. What had once seemed like weakness was revealing itself as a new kind of strength that other leaders wanted to understand and emulate. The prophecies spoke truly. Old Sven observed, his weathered face bright with satisfaction as he watched the celebration unfold. When the gentle giant chose compassion over conquest, when wisdom wed with strength, a new age would dawn for our people. Look around you. See how the old barriers crumble, how enemies become allies when treated with respect rather than fear. The proof of his words was evident throughout the hall. Former opponents of Thyra's rule now served as her most loyal supporters, won over not through force, but through the simple recognition that her leadership brought genuine prosperity rather than mere survival. Even Gunnar the Red, the berserker who had nearly killed Jorund in single combat, now served as captain of the guard, his legendary fury transformed into passionate protection of the new order. But perhaps the most touching change was visible in the hall's corners, where shy young people, those who in previous years would have been mocked or ignored, now danced freely with partners who valued gentleness over aggression, wisdom over wealth. Thyra's elevation had sent a clear message throughout the territory. Worth was not determined by traditional measures of power, but by the content of one's character and the depth of one's commitment to the common good. As the evening reached its peak, Jorund rose and called for silence, his voice carrying easily through the great hall. "Friends, kinsmen, allies from distant shores," he began, his words formal but warm. "We gather tonight not just to celebrate a wedding, but to mark the beginning of something larger. For too long, our people have measured strength by the fear we inspired in others, success by the wealth we could take from enemies. But tonight, we celebrate a different kind of victory. The triumph of love over hatred, of healing over harming, of building rather than destroying." He paused, his grey eyes finding Thyra's across the room, and the love that passed between them was visible to everyone present. "My bride has taught me that the mightiest warrior is not the one who wins every battle, but the one wise enough to know which battles are worth fighting. She has shown me that true leadership comes not from commanding others, but from serving them with all the strength and skill we possess." Thyra rose to stand beside him, her voice joining his in words that would be remembered and repeated throughout the Northern Territories for generations to come. "Together, we choose a path that honors both strength and gentleness, both courage and compassion. We will protect those who need protection, heal those who require healing, and build a future where every person, warrior or farmer, jarl or thrall, can find dignity and purpose." As the celebration continued long into the northern night, with music and dancing and the joyful sounds of a community reborn, the great hall of Vargstad had indeed been transformed. Where once cruel laughter had echoed from walls that witnessed only division and mockery, now there was harmony, acceptance, and the promise of a tomorrow built on love rather than fear. The wedding crown of silver and iron caught the torchlight as Thyra and Jorund moved through their guests, and in its gleaming surface, those who looked closely could see reflected not just their own faces, but the hope of an entire people learning to choose gentleness over violence, wisdom over conquest, and love over everything else that once seemed to matter. The age of the Bearblood had ended. The age of the healer and her gentle giant had begun.